Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this presentation by the American Topical Association. What does ephemera have to do with philately? And to introduce our program and our speaker tonight, I would like to introduce the president of the American Topical Association, Don Hammond.
Welcome, everybody. We're so delighted to have a big crowd here this evening. We have people from other countries who stayed up late and got up early to be here with us, and we really appreciate it. If you are not yet a member of the American Topical Association, we can take care of that very easily. Please go to our website at americantopical.org, and it's real easy to sign up and take advantage of all of our many benefits. I met our speaker, Kurt Sanftleben, at a show at NAPEX about 4 years ago. I was attracted to his booth because of the documents that he has there and the wonderful descriptions that he writes about everything that's in his booth, so you know exactly what you're buying. I bought something that day that I haven't had the chance to use in a collection or an exhibit yet, but I love it nevertheless. It is an invoice for a dry goods store for a Civil War widow and everything that she needed to buy when she became a widow. So on this list are a black dress, a black bonnet, a black shawl, black gloves, a casket, mourning stationery, etc., etc. I think it's amazing to think that a document like that on thin paper written more than 150 years ago is still around. And that's, to me, the fascination of ephemera and why I can spend a couple of hours quite happily at Kurt's booth at shows. But I'm not the speaker, Kurt is, so let me introduce him. Kurt holds a doctorate from the College of William and Mary with a concentration in higher education and a cognate in business. He's retired twice, the first time as an Army officer in 1994, and the second time in 2012 as the civilian director of the Marine Corps Research Center at Quantico, Virginia. He and his wife, Gail, have been selling antiquarian paper Americana since 1998. He is also the author of the Ephemera Corner, a regular article in each issue of Posta, the Journal of American Postal History. Kurt, we're delighted to welcome you, and we can't wait to see what you're going to show us this evening.
Thanks, Dawn. Dawn's already talked about most of this stuff, so I'll whip right through this slide. If you haven't ever read La Posta, I would encourage you to do that. It's a great magazine. There's lots of stuff beyond postal history. I mean, it even has my column about ephemera, so it's worth your while to track down an issue and at least read it and see if you might want to subscribe. It comes out quarterly. But this is pretty close to what I'm going to talk about tonight, just like my columns in La Posta. I don't know if you remember, about a dozen years ago, international exhibitors began to clamor to be able, especially the thematic and topical people, began to clamor to include non-philatelic material into their exhibits. And they argue that it makes exhibits much more interesting, more attractive, and more informative. And the FIP took that under advisement, and they also thought that, well, maybe if you do this, it might encourage new hobbyists to get deeper into our hobby, and it might also encourage people who don't exhibit now to try to put one together. And to that end, they created something they called the Open Class in 2018. And not only did it encourage exhibitors to include ephemera and non-philatelic material, it required them to do so. And it was popular right from the start. The APS followed suit about a year and a half later, and it created a new category called display exhibits. And that really is the same thing. Open and display are practically synonymous. So if you're a topical exhibitor or a thematic exhibitor, you might wonder, well, why should I care about display exhibits? I already have a great exhibit. I have a great topical or thematic collection. Well, here's a couple of reasons I think you ought to at least consider it. First, like topical or thematic exhibits, display exhibits allow the same tremendous variety of options when it comes to choosing the subject matter or a storyline. You can pick anything you want. Additionally, because they force you to include non-philatelic material, you have the most freedom of expression, and you're forced to use this other stuff. And what you'll find is when you do, you can often delve into corners of your theme that you couldn't address using philatelic material because it just doesn't exist. You'll also find that because you can do that, you can tell a much more comprehensive story, and both in breadth and in depth. You can dig into corners that you might otherwise not have been able to do so. I guarantee you, display exhibits or open exhibits with their non-philatelic material captivate viewers. If you've ever watched the exhibit floor, you'll notice that as people go through the aisles, they stop and spend a lot of time at display exhibits. And that's because they're more comprehensive, they're more colorful, they're more interesting, and they're really a lot more fun, I think, to look at. And one last thing, just like topical and thematic exhibits, it doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to spend a fortune when you put together an open or a display exhibit, because there are no preconceived items that you absolutely have to have on the part of the judges. You're free to decide what the key items are in your display. And you can buy this stuff, ephemera, most of it for under 25 bucks. Some of the better items from maybe $100 to $500. And if you really want to splurge, you can spend 4 or 5 figures on different ephemera, but there's no need to. You can put together a great, impressive exhibit without doing that. But this freedom and this opportunity comes with some caveats. First, you need to include a lot of ephemera in your exhibit. You're not going to get away with slapping a couple postcards on a few of your pages, or maybe a travel brochure. That doesn't meet the criteria. You need to have a lot of it. And additionally, besides having a lot of it, judges are going to expect to see that you really know what it is. You know, they want you to be able to explain what the items are, how they relate to your storyline, and also about how they might have been produced, who they were intended to serve, and things like that. So you can include it, you need to include a lot of it, and you need to be able to explain it on your exhibit pages. So I've used ephemera, the term, a couple times. So what does that really mean? Well, about early 1980s, maybe 81 or so, this guy, Maurice Ricards, coined the term ephemera. And he was a historian from Great Britain. And he studied everyday life of everyday people. That was his his research focus. And he used diaries, journals, wills, court orders, I don't know, family trees, all kinds of things to put together his stories, his articles, his research focus. And as he was doing that, he noticed that he kept coming across these small little independent documents, maybe deeds, maybe invoices, maybe receipts, perhaps tickets, little pamphlets, photographs, all this little stuff that really didn't tell a story in and of itself, but if you combine it all, he found it really could fill out his articles and his books that he was writing. And he used ephemera as the term, and he defined it as the minor transient documents of everyday life. So think about that. What he's really saying is, this is the junk that passes through your hands on a daily basis. It was never intended to be collected. It was intended to serve a purpose. It might be a purpose completed in one day, or it might be something you might need to save for a year. But at the end of its useful life, it was intended to have been thrown away. And somehow a lot of this material survived in an envelope or a box, or maybe tucked into a dresser drawer in the attic or the basement. And when you find this stuff in the wild, it looks a lot like this often, a jumble. A lot of it might be damaged, it might be soiled, it might be toned, it might be brittle, it might be folded, creased. But the big thing is it's a jumble. And never, almost never, is there any explanation about what it is. You have to figure that out for yourself by looking at the document, looking at the printed material, looking about the details of who printed it, why it was printed, where it was printed, and also the manuscript entries that tell you, give more clues as to what it really was. And to be honest, most collectors don't want to deal with that. That's not something that appeals to a lot of people. But it does appeal to dealers who sell ephemera. And they're willing to go through with it, get out, cull it, get rid of all the really junk, save the stuff that has some collectible interest, and then organize it and write small, at least rudimentary descriptions. Now, this is a little bit deceptive, this shot, because everything's in shades of buff and tan and brown and gray and white and black. But that's really, and this is good stuff. It has a historical content, and can be certainly related to a lot of different topics. But this isn't what most collectors want to add to their collections or their exhibits. They're looking for stuff like this. They want this bright, colorful material. And it might be a cooking brochure, it might be advertisements, it might be die-cut toys for children, it might be fruit crates, you name it. There's something published with topical relationships in almost anything. But the key thing for all this is it was never intended to be saved. It was never intended to be collected. It's not issued as a collectible, but you'll find it nonetheless. So you might be wondering, well, who really collects all this stuff? And there are a lot of people do. You bet it's collectible. This is a picture of a paper fair, and it's about an hour and a half before the fair begins, and the foyer is already packed, people waiting to buy their tickets. The crowd spills out the door, down the walkway, way over here, and into the parking lot, way out here. And this is an hour and a half before the show starts. And these people are patiently waiting in line. You see more people going out to get in line. This is another shot of a paper fair inside a venue. And here again, they're waiting for the show to open. And the crowd is jammed in here, and it actually goes way out here into the lobby and back around behind this bank of elevators and stairs. And these people are passionate about their collections. They all collect different things, but everything they collect is significant to them. That's how they differ from maybe book collectors and maybe stamp collectors or postal history collectors. They have a personal vested interest in their topics. It might be their occupation, it might be their schools, it might be the sports they play or their favorite sports teams, it could be their other hobbies. Whatever it is, they have a passion and they collect it by the bushels. And they're very enthusiastic, far more enthusiastic than most stamp collectors or book collectors. I do book fairs and stamp shows and paper shows, and I will tell you that anecdotally, far more people attend paper fairs and buy paper than they do either stamps, postal history, or books. When this lady opens the gate, it's going to be like rope drop at Walt Disney World. These people are going to run in. I mean, literally, I mean, these aren't spring chickens here, but they are going to actually run in to get to the booths that they want to visit. And they know a lot of the dealers and they know who might have stuff they particularly want to see. And so you're probably thinking, where's the enthusiasm coming from? It's because they have a vested personal interest in what they collect. Another big group of people who collect ephemera are academics, librarians, archivists, curators. In fact, I make most of my sales to these people. And if you remember, Maurice Ricards was a historian, and he began to use this stuff in his writings, and his fellow historians saw that. They would discuss it. They wanted to use the same kind of materials. It spread to other people in the soft sciences. Anthropologists can use this stuff in their work, sociologists sometimes. And so they clamored for their university libraries and their university archives and special collections to start building collections that they could use. And that's been, what, almost 45 years ago now. And the universities and the museums and the archives took it to heart. And today, almost every academic institution, they have massive collections of ephemera and paper. And this is actually a class that was held for archivists and librarians. And the students have already gone through a couple of lectures, and they're in a practical exercise, and they're going through this round robin, and they're looking at all these different pieces of ephemera that are laid out at different stations. And it's their task to, without anything other than what's on the table, to try to figure out what it is, how it was used, and why it might or might not be important. And then they work to write up a short description about it, that if they were to have it in their collection, that they could use for their catalogs. Another major consumer, the group of consumers for ephemera, are scrapbookers and artists. And I apologize in advance if any of you are scrapbookers or artists, because while these people buy tons of it, they destroy it, quite frankly. They destroy it two ways. One, they aren't usually satisfied just buying a nice piece of ephemera, historical ephemera. Somehow, many have an urge to improve it by making it look older than it is, or more impressive it is. And they think by tearing off corners, they can make it look older. They might gouge out a hunk of it in hopes of making it look like maybe it's a mouse nibble or a rat nibble. They might scallop the edges of maps or documents. I guess the idea is to make them look more official and more impressive. And even if they have a big piece, they aren't adverse to tearing it down to like show wear. Well, normal wear doesn't occur like that. So, you know, it was done by the scrapbooker and the artist. And sometimes they even go as far as taking a flame and singeing the edges to make it look like it was burnt in a fire. But once they do that, the collectible value and the historical value just disappears, as does the monetary value. The other thing they do, even if they don't mistreat it, they slap glue all over the back of it, often non-soluble or insoluble glue, and they paste it as hard as they can down to a page or a piece of poster board. And once that happens, it's never coming up to be used again without really severe damage. Now, the final group of people who collect this stuff are really serious collectors. And these are researchers. They might not be academics by trade, but they are amateur historians. They are amateur people who study business practices, things like that. And they might collect ephemera to trace the development of a certain printing process, or maybe the development of an industry, or a particular factory and how it grew. It might be something where they trace westward expansion in some manner. At this conference, the focus was on international relations and conflict and resolution. Some of them, I know one guy who collects railroads for the railroad line that used to run behind his house. So people collect this and research it for whatever reason. And These folks are very serious, and they belong to this organization here, the Ephemera Society of America. And that's analogous to APS. And just like APS, they have an annual conference, an annual show convention for 3 to 5 days each spring, the same place in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, at the same hotel. And that conference is just like the Great American Stamp Show. Very, very similar. They will have exhibits. Their exhibits aren't as many or as formal as stamp exhibits, but they'll have exhibits nonetheless. They'll have meetings of sub-interest groups, just like our societies meet at stamp shows. They'll have a series of lectures and presentations and seminars, and this is where they excel. These are very, very interesting and incredibly researched presentations, and they use ephemeral pieces to illustrate it. And they far surpass anything that we do in book fairs, even the best book fairs, or even the best stamp shows. While stamp people might concentrate on exhibits as the key to their show, these people concentrate on presentations. But the big thing that you will probably want to be aware of is that they invite 40 to 50 of the premier ephemera dealers in the country to set up on their exhibit, on their dealer floor. And you will find an incredible variety of ephemera, volumes of it, at in inexpensive prices as low as $3 or so, all the way up to 5 figures. So if you can spare the time, it might be worth your while, if you're going to collect ephemera or add ephemera to your exhibit, to attend. And the dates vary, but it's going to be sometime in March or April every year. Now, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of types of ephemera, and I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but this is an abbreviated list. And it goes on and on and on. And what you'll find when you get into this stuff is that within each of these types, literally, there are tens of thousands of pieces of ephemera that relate to an incredible array of topics. In fact, any topic you can almost imagine, you're going to be able to find illustrated on some piece of ephemera or related to some piece of ephemera. Now, we'd be here all night if I was to go through these things and show you examples. So what I've done is I put a slide together to give you an idea of what this stuff looks like. You're familiar with a lot of these things, but I mean, if you look at it, you can see the richness of the material, and just like it's the tip of the iceberg of the types of ephemera, it's also the tip of the iceberg, even more so, of the illustrations and the topics that you might be able to relate the stuff to. But this is not unique. There's a lot of this stuff out there. So you might be thinking, I wonder how I can use this stuff in my exhibit. Let's say you've got a great topical exhibit on the history of Chicago, and you want to create a page about the Great Chicago Fire, because you came across this nice advertising cover. It's a little trimmed, but it's still nice. Big overall illustration of a fire wagon from the 1880s, sold by a Chicago manufacturer. And it's postmarked just a few days before Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern and nearly incinerated the whole city. So it's a great piece. And I'll tell you a little secret. Dealers, cover dealers, postal history dealers don't always look at what's inside these envelopes, and sometimes they don't even look at what's on the reverse. They're interested in getting the stuff out there and getting it sold. And so they'll look at it and say, oh, that's a nice advertising cover. It's trimmed. How about I put $45 on there, $50, whatever. But I would say, as you're browsing through dealers' booths and you're flipping through the boxes of covers, if you come across something, even if it doesn't have a nice illustration on the front, and you think it might be related to your topic, look inside, because you never know what you might find, and look on the reverse. In this case, there's a sales letter, has the same great illustration up the top. It advertises other firefighting equipment that the dealer sells. It's a great letter about closing the deal on a fire wagon that the company had sold to a town in Ohio. And on the reverse, there's this wonderful wood engraving of a fireman hitching a team to a different type of fire wagon. This is a hose wagon, which presumably he's about to take over to this city street to help fight this inferno going on in one of the buildings. So this is almost a no-brainer how you could exhibit this. You know, you make a great copy, you know, a high-quality copy of the contents in the reverse, and you mount the cover on the top. But while it's really a centerpiece and it's nice, if you look at it, it really isn't very vibrant. The paper's buff. Maybe that's toning, maybe that's the way the paper originally was. But you have that buff color. The illustrations are in light gray green or kind of a grayish black. And it doesn't have a lot of vibrancy. And it might not be as captivating as it could be. And there's a way you can help solve that. You don't necessarily have to use it as one complete piece. You keep the cover mounted separately. You shrink the illustration down so you make room on your page. And then you might be able to add stuff to that page that could pep it up a little bit. Like what? Maybe you could find an invitation to a fireman's ball. Maybe a turn of the century cigar box label. Rather gaudy, but pretty nice at the same time. You might be able to find a fireman's parade ribbon, and they gave these out. Firemen loved parades at the turn of the century. They also had competition between different engine companies. It might be marching competitions, drill competitions, acrobatic competitions, band competitions. And when they would invite special guests, they'd often give them ribbons, which would indicate that they were entitled to preferential seating, the best seats to view the exhibits or the competitions or the parade, and maybe for access to a tent where refreshments were served. But you can find these, they are not at all uncommon, just as ribbons that were produced by labor unions, business associations, veterans organizations, lots of different organizations had similar ribbons, and almost all are related to some type of a topic subject. You might be able to find an old tintype or a photo of a fireman that you could include. And I ought to mention that all of this stuff are things that I have sold at different times. So it's not impossible to find it. It's out there. Or even you might be able to find a advertising trade card of a milkmaid, milk and old bossy, just like created the inferno supposedly in Chicago. But your choices, the point is the choices you can make to pep up an exhibit page are really endless. Now, you're probably also wondering, okay, I get it. There's a lot of stuff out there, but how can I actually arrange this stuff on pages? You know, that could be a difficult process, and it is. And for my money, this lady right here, her name is Iva Moritz, this is her husband, Henrik. I don't know her, but I do know him. He's a customer. They are Denmark's dynamic duo of Philately, and she's one of the premier open exhibit creators in the world. And Henrik is an expert on Danish philately. He wrote the book on it. In fact, he wrote more than one book. He has like 7 or 8 volumes all about Danish postage. And he has caught the open exhibiting bug from his wife. And she has a fascinating exhibit, and it's called Denmark, a Royal Menage a Trois and its Historical Consequences. And she just reaped in the awards by the bucketful when she was on the circuit. And I think she still might send it out now and then. But before I show you the pages, let me tell you a little bit about the topic. In the 1770s, early 1770s, a young king assumed the throne of Denmark. And there are various variations of the tale, but some say he was mentally ill. But regardless, he was a real lout, and he didn't want to do any kingly business at all. All he wanted to do was sleep all day and then go out with his buds and carouse through Copenhagen at night. And they would go to, they would get incredibly drunk. Didn't matter if it was a nice tavern. Actually, they preferred gin joints hidden down dark alleys. They would terrorize civilians. They would draw their rapiers and swords and threaten them. They loved to fight. If they couldn't find civilians, other folks to fight, they fought among themselves. They were real brawlers. They gambled like crazy, and they lost tons of money. And usually they would cap off their evening with 3 or 4 hours of whoring. They would visit all kinds of bordellos and brothels, often taking their business out into the streets. And this just created an incredible problem for the country. The king's stepmother, the Queen Dowager, was appalled. Court advisors were appalled. Royal family members were appalled. The civic governments were appalled. But they really didn't do anything until he got married. And he married a cousin from Hanover. And she came over to Copenhagen. And after he dutifully sired an heir, he completely ignored her. And she was incredibly lonely, disconsolate. But she found companionship in the arms of the court surgeon, the king's personal physician. And they engaged in this incredibly torrid and public love affair, which further enraged the public and the court and the Queen Mother, the Dowager. And it also, the whole scandal became apparent to the other royal courts in Europe. And that really concerned the Queen Mother and the royal court and the civilians, because it appeared for a while like the Danish royal house would fall. And they could well be subjected to rule, by other countries. So they put their collective feet down, and it's not a very pretty tale, but the king was confined to the palace and the grounds, pretty much like under house arrest. The queen was shipped back to her parents in Hanover without her child, who was a royal heir, so the child remained in Copenhagen. And the poor physician was tossed into the dungeon, and he was tortured. And eventually he either confessed or was found guilty of treason. And to make an example of him, he was sentenced to die by being drawn and quartered. Now, I'm not sure if you know what that means, but if you've seen Braveheart, that's how Mel Gibson meets his end at the end of it. Now, I don't know that they disemboweled the physician or castrated him and then fried his body parts in front of him, but he was bound, drawn behind a horse or ox-drawn cart through the town, over the cobblestones. He was pelted with rocks and stones, beaten with clubs and sticks. And he was in pretty bad shape when he arrived at the executioner. And when he was dragged up to the scaffold, the platform, the executioner promptly lopped off his right hand. And while he was still trying to take that in, they forced his head down onto the chopping block, and the executioner chopped off his head and then brandished it to a cheering crowd. Afterwards, the executioner hacked his body into 4 pieces, impaled them securely on pikes, which were taken throughout Denmark and planted in different locations as a lesson to future traders. And they stayed there until they rotted away. So anyway, this rather gruesome, horrific tale is displayed with exquisite taste by this lovely lady. And it's really interesting. And here are a couple of her pages. And you can see how well she prepared the exhibit. She meets all the criteria of a display or an open exhibit. She's got a nice chapter heading with a subheading. She has a really balanced mix of philatelic material and ephemera. So the balance is both in terms of material and it's aesthetically balanced. And she does a wonderful job describing it. Remember I said judges expect to see that you know what you're doing? Well, here she explains how the items, in black text, she explains how the items relate, advance, or storyline. And then she uses this sort of dark red and maroon italics to explain the significance and the specifications, if you will, of the items, whether they're philatelic or ephemeral. So it's a first-class exhibit from start to finish, incredibly well balanced, very tasteful, and it tells a most interesting story. And I would encourage you to look at this exhibit. You can see it online, along with other great display and open exhibits. I forget the website, but a Google search on her name and the exhibit should turn it up or turn it up online for you. And it's worth spending some time to see how really professional, wonderful championship exhibits are put together. So if I've whet your interest in maybe doing this, you might be thinking, well, where can I find this stuff? I don't remember seeing it as I wander through most stamp shows. Where can I find it? Well, I already mentioned one place is this society convention. If you really want to get into it, it might be worth spending a day or two, not necessarily to pay to attend the whole conference, but to pay $5 or whatever they charge to get in and visit the dealers. Because I guarantee you can find something that'll be related to your topic at all price points. You can also find the stuff at paper shows. And I showed you pictures from both of these earlier. They have one, there are only two in the country. One is at Hartford, Connecticut, and one is at the fairgrounds in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And they have a tremendous amount of dealers. This one has well over 100 almost every time they run it, each time twice a year. And you usually don't see people from here exhibiting here. These are mom and pop booths. They're often eBay sellers. They might have booths at antique malls. They might buy up and collect the stuff to bring to these shows. They might do a lot of antique shows or flea markets. But regardless, you can find volumes and volumes of paper at these shows. It might not be as well organized as at the convention, and it might be a jumble. It might not be in condition that's as nice as the ephemera you find up here, but it's usually very, very reasonable. Oh, I said you won't find dealers that exhibit here at these shows. That's not exactly true. You won't find them exhibiting here, but it's not unusual to see them shopping these shows because that is where they buy a lot of the things they resell after they improve the descriptions and improve the cataloging. You can also find this stuff at stamp shows and book fairs. And you might be thinking, well, I go to a lot of stamp shows. I don't remember seeing this stuff as I walk up and down the aisle. Same thing at book fairs, but that's partly because stamp dealers and cover dealers and antiquarian book dealers, ephemera is not their prime product. They're selling books, covers, and stamps. It doesn't mean they don't have ephemera. So as you walk through the aisles, you might ask a dealer if they have anything, any non-philatelic material or any ephemera, because you never know, they might pull out a box or two from under the table and you might find a whole bunch of great stuff. So how do you know when they hold these shows? Well, you go to the APS website or you go to the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America website and you go to their events page and you'll get a list of all the upcoming events in their yearly calendar. And it isn't just the big sponsored events by the association, but it's also other regional events that are going to be held. And don't forget to visit your local antique stores, your local antique malls, especially, because at antique malls, there are a lot of people who sell collectible paper. And you can, at your leisure, flip through the stuff at their booths and tell them what you might find. Also, there are a series of antique fairs and festivals and flea markets that are held around the country, and those are great places to find ephemera also. And finally, a whole lot of ephemera is sold online. Of course, there's eBay. You're probably familiar with eBay. And in fact, eBay has a separate section dedicated to paper ephemera. And you can buy it either in bulk, or they also have quite a few individual pieces that are always available, either for as buy it nows or even auctions. Don't forget about hip stamp. You can search hip stamp, and it's amazing the amount of ephemera that dealers list there. So eBay and hip stamp are great places to look for this stuff. Dealer websites, there are a bunch of them. How do you find them? Well, you go to the trade organization web pages, and I guarantee you'll find a way to search dealers' websites. And you can usually filter them and so that you turn up listings of websites of dealers who primarily sell ephemera or at least have substantial ephemera available for sale. There are online auction consolidators, for example, Stamp Auction Network. You're probably familiar with that. If you think about the home page, normally down the left-hand column, there's a list of upcoming stamp auctions, but there's also a search box in there, and you can search on ephemera, and you will get tons and tons of listings, specific lots of ephemera that are going to be sold at upcoming auctions. There are other consolidators for mainstream auctions, mainstream public auctions. My favorite is Live Auctioneers, and all the big auction houses in the country and internationally list their upcoming auctions at Live Auctioneers, and they will have all of their lots illustrated and described, usually 2 weeks to a month in advance. And you're able to go through them and read the descriptions, look at the illustrations. They have a wonderful search engine, and you can actually identify things you want to pop up in your My Favorites list. And so that when they come up, you're able to see exactly when they're going to be coming up for auction. And when they do come up, well, you can either leave an absentee bid or you're able to bid live. It's very easy to do. Sometimes at the bigger auctions, they have a streaming video of the auction as it's going on that you can interact with, and you'll actually see the auctioneer accepting bids for the items, and you'll be able to put in yours when the time is right. At other auctions, it might be more like a chat box, and you can follow the auction there and track it as the bids increase, and whenever you're ready, you can click on it and place a bid in real time. I buy a lot of stuff here. The stamp community doesn't do this so much, but the book and paper community have a lot of meta search websites. So what do I mean by that? Well, these are the most popular. There are these websites where book and paper dealers list their entire inventory, and book and paper dealers do a better job of listing their inventory than stamp dealers do. They all have almost all have illustrations. They almost all have really solid descriptions, and most of them list their entire stock, or at least their better stock. And so there are literally several thousand dealers from around the world that list at ABE Books or some of these other sites, thousands of dealers. Each one of them, I don't know about each one of them, but many dealers have as many as 30,000 items online. Others maybe 1,000, some down to 20 or 50. But you can literally search million or more different listings through this little search box here, and by clicking on the little magnifying glass, and exactly what you were looking for is going to come up. I mean, you can, well, I can't guarantee that, but things that are related to your search, whatever keyword you use are going to come up, and then you can browse through all of them at one time. It's an incredible way to find things. And lastly, there are online shows. And again, the book and paper fair communities are far ahead of the stamp community in this. If you visit an online stamp show, probably what you're most likely to find is a list of dealer names. And if you click on the links, it'll take you to their eBay listings. Well, it's a different story in the book world, and it's because of this guy, Marvin Getman. He was a well-known and excellent show promoter for antique shows, for paper fairs, and for books throughout New England and throughout the mid-Atlantic states. And he had a tremendous following. A lot of people went to his shows, and they were great shows, both from a dealer and a collector perspective. But he was stopped dead in his tracks by COVID. And when that happened, he wasn't ready to retire. He was in his, I think, late 60s at the time. And he was planning on keeping his business going. So what he did was he spent a lot of money and he hired a website developer, and they put together this system that really comes close to approximating what a real physical book fair or paper fair dealer floor would look like. Have a whole bunch of dealers. They all have their own booths. You can figuratively walk between the booths. He publishes something that's like a book fair guide where you can figure out what the booksellers are specialized in. It'll tell you what booth number they're in. You can visit those booths. I mean, you can interact with the dealers. You can interact with them all by email or chat or text. Some of them use Zoom so they can talk to you. It's available 24 hours a day when the show is going on. So obviously you can't contact them day and night. But he also will let you know when the show is going to open. And he has a countdown clock. And when it gets down to the final hours or minutes, hundreds of people, at least hundreds, maybe thousands of people watch this like a hawk. Because when it gets down to zero, they can click this link and enter the fair. And they're immediately presented with a list of all the different dealers, and they rush to go to their favorites or the ones they know that have supplies or items they need. And a lot of books are sold here, a lot of art, a lot of photographs, a lot of historical materials, and a whole lot of ephemeral. In fact, historical materials and ephemeral items are the biggest sellers. And Marvin runs specialized shows where it's mostly books. He runs specialized shows with maybe a lot of autographs, and he runs specialized paper shows, which he calls paper paloozas. And I would recommend that if you're interested in buying ephemera, you visit his shows, especially the book ones and the paper paloozas, because you're going to find a lot of stuff there. So that probably pretty much concludes what I wanted to talk about this evening. What we did was we looked at how ephemera first became connected to philately, and then we looked at what ephemera really is and the types of ephemera, and we saw some examples. Then we looked at how you might use ephemera in conjunction with your philatelic items to compose a page. And then we looked at one of the premier display open exhibits out there to get an appreciation for how you actually can construct your exhibit. And finally, we capped it off with looking at where you can find this stuff. So with that, I thank you for your time. I don't know how much time you have left or you want to devote to this, but I'm willing to take any type of questions or comments you might have. And while I do so, I'll leave you with some shameless plugs for my business. For my two websites, I have a main one where I sell my better items. I have a hip stamp site where I sell a lot of inexpensive ephemera and postal history. I don't have a lot of postal history loaded yet, but I'm in the progress. And also how to get my catalogs. I no longer send these out in hard copy, but they're sent out digitally. And one last thing, I also set up at about 8 paper stamp or book fairs each year, and my next fair coming up is Chicago Picks. So if you're going to be there, I hope you stop by and pay me a visit. Anyway, if you've got questions and you have time for it, I'm willing to take them.
We do have a question from Jane. I attended the Ephemera Society of America show earlier this year. As expected, the majority of the material was US centric. Can you recommend major ephemera shows that offer international material?
Yes, visit Great Britain. They have lots.
Oh,
I'm serious.
yeah.
You know, if you want international ephemera, the best place to find it is in countries outside of the United States. I'm not being facetious, but that's just the way it is. I would also recommend that when you go to regular stamp shows, that you visit dealers who specialize in the countries you want, that you collect, and ask them the same question I said earlier. Ask them if they have any non-philatelic material. Frequently they do.
Okay. Mike Vagnetti asked if you had a website, and then right after he asked the question, you posted
Put it
this
up.
last
I do.
image. So, so that works. And Al Ratty, would you consider magazines ephemera?
Yeah, magazines and comic books and that kind of stuff are considered ephemera. And people don't necessarily exhibit the whole magazine or the whole comic book.
Mhm.
They might, if it's not a valuable magazine or comic book as a whole. They often extract pages that are applicable to their exhibit. And that's, you know, you hear all the time that you shouldn't break books or you shouldn't break up this kind of stuff. But in truth, if there's very little value to it anyway, or if it's already been damaged, there really isn't any harm in it, especially if it's already been damaged. So yes, or you can fold it just so that, you know, whatever you want to focus on is visible.
As to where you, the second half of that question was, where can I find magazines and other collectors of magazines? I mean, you can find old magazines everywhere. I mean, perfectly.
Yes, and actually there are a lot of at antique malls, there are a lot of dealers that sell old magazines. There are flea markets, you'll be able to find old magazines, and they're all around you, really. You're right, Eric. You can find them everywhere.
And I
You
got
just have to
this
open
one
your
a couple.
eyes. Yeah,
I got that one a couple of days ago because it's got an article on one of my areas in it.
yeah.
So, and Tom Corrali, I think, how much ephemera in a thematic exhibit would change it from thematic to display?
I don't know. I don't think it's specified. You know, I haven't read the FIP or the APS rules in a while. But if you want to find a definitive answer to that, I would suggest you read those guidelines or those rules for exhibiting and judging, and it might quantify it. But I do know that you're supposed to include a lot of it, and it's supposed to be kind of balanced. Obviously, the philately or the philatelic aspect of your exhibit is forefront, but you need to have a lot of the other stuff as well. I suppose it's also judge specific. But a good place to start would be to review those guidelines and judge and exhibiting rules.
I would mention that in the National Topical Stamp Show, the all thematic stamp show that's held at the Great American Stamp Show, about 90% of our exhibits are display for just the reasons that Kurt had mentioned earlier.
Okay, Sarah G asks, have you seen any trends or movements in the types of ephemera people are searching for? Or is it more based on personal interest?
Based a lot on personal interest, but I started out 25 years ago. My wife and I started out and we sold books almost exclusively. Specifically, we sold kids' books, series books. We sold, you remember like Dick Jane, or not Dick and Jane. Well, we did sell some of those, but like the Hardy Boys, stuff like that. Because that was the hottest stuff going on in the book market. And gradually we moved into ephemera and to historical documents and advertising and photograph albums. And eventually we've kind of centered now where our main focus is what we sell, what we call paper Americana and personal narratives. And that's kind of what Dawn was talking about earlier that she bought from me. And our primary customers are universities and archives. But I will tell you that when I started out, nobody was selling the kind of stuff that I'm selling now, 25 years ago. That wasn't on the radar. And we were one of the first dealers in the book world to start concentrating on this historical material. And other dealers had some ephemera. But within the last 10 years, the trend among book dealers has been to move to the kind of stock I sell because it's unique, it's interesting. You know, I mean, you might have to pay a lot for a first edition of Jane Eyre or something, but you know what? When you go online, you can find 100 copies of them. It's not unique. It's not anything special. It's just a matter of whether you want to pay the money to get one. But the stuff I sell and about maybe 4 or 5 other serious dealers in the historical arena, the stuff we sell, it's all unique. And there's an ever-growing number of people who sell the kind of things that we do. And there's a whole lot of dealers now who sell colorful ephemera. And I sell some of that, but my stuff is more geared to historians and historical material. So there's been a definite trend over the, I would say over the last 10 to 12 years, moving away from books into this type of stuff. Now, when I set up at stamp shows, I don't see many people selling the kind of stuff I do. There might be a couple, and some of the postal history dealers might have a box of stuff. Denny Peoples has a lot of this kind of stuff, if you know Denny. But the trend is not as pronounced in the stamp community as it is in the book and paper community.
I think we've got, maybe let's take one more and then I think we're going to have to call it a night, but we'd love to have Kurt back, I think.
Well, in that case, Cynthia Scott has the last question. I'm happy to learn that ephemera does not have to bear postage, at least in a display exhibit. When would postage be important on ephemera for exhibiting purposes?
Well, I think it can always be important. It's nice if you can, if you can combine that, you know, if you can add a philatelic, or if you find something ephemeral in nature that sometime that has a philatelic component to it, and you can often find that with regard to old newspapers that were sent, you know, old documents. You can always find revenue stamps. You can find some pre-printed cards. I remember, if you remember when there was the big anthrax scare and everybody was concerned about, you know, the representatives and senators and government officials being sent envelopes or stuff that was contaminated. There were all kinds of interesting disinfected markings, things like that. So you can find a good mix of different ephemera that has a stamp on it. It might have been mailed. It might have been used for revenue purposes. So, and I think personally that increases the interest if you can find an item that has a foot in both camps.
Yeah. 2 I can come up with off the top of my head are war ballots.
Yeah.
From the World War II area, and the postcards that ham radio operators send each other.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes, certainly.
Well, you did whet our appetites, that's for sure, Kurt.
Well, good.
We've had a huge crowd here tonight and lots of comments and questions. We've enjoyed every minute of it, and we do thank you, and we'd love to have you back another time to hear more about this exciting topic. But I'm anxious now to take all of your suggestions and do some shopping and find more ephemera. And I think plenty of others feel that way too. Thanks
No,
again.
I think if you go back through the show, you'll see the links and you'll be able to find the topics to search on with Google, and you shouldn't have any trouble at all.
Yeah, that's
And
locating more information.
great fun.
And
Okay.
a reminder to everybody, this will be posted on the ATA website and our YouTube channel presently. So
You're getting lots of thanks here from people that
Yes.
attended. Kurt, thanks so
Absolutely.
much.
Yes,
Thank you,
glad you-
everybody. We'll
very
see you
much.
next
Yeah,
time.